Hello and welcome back to the Futurism at J2 podcast. Today I'm joined by Ricardo,
So,
and today's topic is privacy and security. So, Ricardo, why don't you take it away? I know you have an awesome story.
kind of awesome and a little bit creepy, depending on how you want to look at it. I go to Mexico every year to visit family. I'm from there. I grew up there. And so last time we actually went this summer. And the difference between all the times that I've gone so far and this time was the fact that I went on plane, just because of time constraints. We usually drive there. And the process for crossing the border from Mexico back into the US is pretty easy. So you just go there, you hand in your documents, your US passport, they make sure that the documents are legitimate and that everybody's passports who is in the car are there. They just check basic stuff, they call up names, make sure everybody's in there, good to go, hand them back, and then you're, on your way back to, a place in the US. But this time when I went and actually came back to the US by plane at the airport, the process was actually a little bit different. My dad was ready to hand out the passport. He had him on his hand. So we reached the person who was checking those documents. And, my dad was ready to approach him and just give him the documents, make sure everything's good to go and move on. But this time it was a little bit different. They actually had us, wait for a little bit, and they made each one of us stand in a particular spot. And it wasn't until everybody was done doing whatever we had to do in that particular spot that I noticed that we were actually in front of a webcam. And it's not like an expensive or specialized webcam either. It's a webcam that I've actually looked into buying before for online classes, back when those were a more relevant thing. Now that we have, IRL classes, it's actually the Logitech C920, which is an HD webcam. Anybody can buy this, and that webcam was attached to a computer system. And although I'm not exactly sure, I didn't ask, but I'm pretty sure what they did is they had the camera scan our faces, and see if we were in the database for people with valid U.S. passports. Because whenever each one of us stood in front of the camera, a few seconds later, like maybe 1 or 2 seconds after we stood there, the person would just call out our names exactly as they were, and we would just answer yes, and then we would move on to the next person, which I thought was really odd because I've never experienced that, and passing through the border was just completely different. We'd actually had to hand out physical passports, but this time it wasn't like that. It was completely digital. My dad never had to hand in his physical or our physical U.S. passports, and what I believe it to be is that our faces were just scanned for recognizing if we were in the passport database, which a little bit creepy and a little bit cool in both ways. So you guys can think about if it's creepy or not. But yeah, that's essentially sort of the primer for this topic that we're going to be talking about, which deals with a lot of security issues and things of that sort.
So, do you think that made the whole process, like, did it make the process faster and, like, was it more convenient for you guys?
I think it definitely sort of made it faster. It was a little bit weird, and I think it was a little bit more convenient because usually it takes around like 5 minutes to check like passports, make sure they're all right, and move on. But this time it took like maybe like 2 minutes for us everybody to line up, get their faces scanned, and move on to that. That was basically it, right? They just called our names, scanned us, called our names. If we responded yes, that was pretty much it. It was pretty hassle free, I will say. So
And you said this is on the US side, right? So the US going into Mexico?
yes, and that's actually one of the things that I forgot to say. So when we were going from the U.S. to Mexico, so we landed at an airport in Mexico, and we passed through immigration there, and there we actually had to hand in our physical passports. It was an
Okay.
actual person
Gotcha.
like looking at the documents, whereas in the U.S. side, whenever we were going through immigration to get into the U.S., it was the camera-based system.
Okay. So I think this kind of raises the point of like, so Mexico basically did it the traditional way with the documents, the
Yeah.
physical documents, and then the U.S. side did it with, I guess, this was facial recognition, basically,
That's what I would
right?
assume, so because it used the camera and just had us stay in like a particular spot.
So I'm curious, is this like what is the legality of using facial recognition? Because is this like something that is written in law, like border, whatever, like customs and border patrol and whatever, like they can use whatever technology they want? Or is it something that's just not regulated so they can kind of just do whatever? Like, what do you think?
I'm not exactly sure on those. I don't, so don't quote me on the legality. I don't want to get in like legal trouble. But what I would presume is that they have special rights to be able to do that. So they have some sort of special legality to do that. Because I know that, with a lot of concerns happening around facial recognition, and especially control that comes with the software, I know that you can't necessarily implement it with a lot of stuff. Like police before have tried to implement it, but it hasn't gone through. Same thing with other forms of legal action or industries. But that hasn't happened. But it was pretty notable to see border patrol essentially or immigration being able to use that technology. So I'm pretty sure they have a special permit, and in my opinion, it might also be sort of like a trial run to see how well the technology works in a very quote unquote like safe environment where you're not going to necessarily get arrested. Like the worst thing that can happen is just having to check the physical documents to make sure that you're actually legally entering the country and stuff like that. So I think that's the way they're trying to do it. So test the software in a pretty safe and regular environment, so they can perfect this sort of stuff. But I definitely think it's like a specialized license. They probably have to be able to do this.
Okay. And wait, did you say you were wearing a mask while you were doing this?
No, they actually had us take the mask. Like we had a mask inside of the airport, and they were like, "Okay, take the mask off."
Oh, okay.
So that's why I'm like pretty sure it was facial recognition.
Because I'm curious, like what mask wearing. Because I remember reading an article probably a couple months ago. Don't quote me on this. You should fact check this yourself. But
Yes.
it was like, it's like facial recognition is still over like 90 or 95% like accurate, even with masks on.
Yeah.
Like it can still tell, which I find kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Like the masks provide very limited protection from facial recognition. Like it's an extremely advanced technology. So in a way, like if you're ever in a public space where there's, cameras and, assuming they're, doing facial recognition, like there's no way to hide from it, right? Like they're just always tracking you. Like this reminds me of, in China, for example, they've kind of completely blanketed like all the cities and just like spy cameras like everywhere. Like I've heard, obviously all in the public spaces, but even like outside people's like homes and stuff, I've heard.
Yeah.
Again, do your own research on this, but it's kind of crazy to me. Like how, to me, that seems really dystopian. Like, I don't know if you've read the book, like 1984.
Definitely.
Like Big Brother, George Orwell.
A lot of you guys listening will probably have read this in school before.
Yeah.
At least have heard of the title.
But like, it really feels 1984 dystopian to me. Like, they know where everyone is all the time. You combine like facial recognition with like your like internet footprint and stuff.
Yeah.
And they pretty much know everything you're doing and where you are, who you are at all times.
Yeah.
To me, that's just,
It's
I mean,
insane.
this is like this wasn't a problem like 30 years or whatever, 50 years ago. Like it's kind of the dawn of the internet and AI and mass surveillance that's kind of made privacy, I feel like, non-existent.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, maybe I would put this up for debate, but do you think we have a reasonable assumption of privacy anymore? Like, is privacy a thing? Like, is it even like a valid word anymore? Like, I don't know.
I think the only privacy that you could attain realistically in today's world is if you were like a hermit living in the middle of the forest with no like technology. Because everything's so connected, right? If you have a job, you have to connect to the people in your job somehow. You have to perform internet searches. You have to, essentially give out all this information to create as much as I hate to say it, like a digital version of yourself out there, which people can track. And the government surely does. I'm sure they do to some extent, But yeah, I definitely feel like realistically there is no real sense of privacy as it was maybe like 30 years ago, right? Just because everything's so connected and the fact that we depend so much on this technology sort of makes us vulnerable to a lot of these breaches in our privacy that we couldn't even imagine before.
Yeah, I mean, like, think about all the information that you have on your, like, phone and computer. Like, it's your whole life.
Yeah,
It's really everything we do is online. Like, there's so little. You can tell pretty much everything about a person based on
on their
like all
search
their
history.
on their search history, their photos, like everything. Um, I guess going back to the China example, another interesting thing that's going on there is this social credit system,
Right.
where basically, on top of they can track everything everyone is doing.
Yeah.
They can give people basically like credit scores, like credit card, they can like track your like spending and
Right. Right.
spending habits and like give you a credit score. This is basically like a social credit score. So like your criminal history and like the ways you behave,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
giving you a score based on that. So like how exemplary of a citizen you are. And basically the idea is the higher your score, like the more benefits and stuff you have. And like if it gets too low, like that's not good. Like you're on the
On the
government's
watch
like bad
list.
side.
Yeah.
So I'm interested what you think about that. Like, do you think this is? I kind of see it as like it could be used for good, but it also be used for bad.
Yeah.
It's like it's also very dystopian where it's like they have ultimate control over everything everyone does.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that also I think brings a lot of security because you can track everything everyone does, which means you can easily track criminals.
Right.
You can prevent like fraudulent activity and stuff like that. So there's definitely it goes back to the core of the issue, which is like giving up your privacy
Right.
for potentially more security.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think about the social credit system?
I think it's a super tricky situation. I feel like the way that at least China's implementing it is not great. Purely because the social credit system, again, do your research. I'm not too well versed on this, but from what I've heard, the social credit system is more dependent on like your affiliation with the government and your likeness of the government rather than being a good person. So at least in China's like interpretation of social credit, I think it's a little bit different. But the idea as a whole, I feel like brings a lot of questions, especially ethical ones.
Yeah, for sure.
Because everybody has different experiences with everybody else. You can't really know a person unless you meet them. Um, and one of the things that like a social credit or a type of scoring system would do is, or you have to watch everybody. There's sort of like this sense like, would you feel safer if everybody was maybe in your like neighborhood, everybody was watching everybody 24/7? Sure, but at the same time, it's a little bit creepy, right?
Yeah,
Like you're sleeping, people are watching you.
it's
You're
really
doing
what you
whatever, people
value
are watching
more.
it. And technically, I guess that in a way, like yeah, that would prevent people from doing bad stuff because you know you would immediately be able to tell. Um, but personally, I feel like privacy, in a way, has a little bit more importance than security, just due to personal autonomy, right? Just being able to do things. Um, because at the end of the day, a lot of people have differing opinions. What the majority considers to be good might not necessarily be the actual good. Of course, we have like ethical discussions. We try to make like general responsibilities as good for everybody as possible. There are instances where a lot of things are more opinion based rather than factual, where a lot of the information can be swayed in one way or another, and the general population or general public's consensus on a specific subject might not necessarily be what you consider to be right, or might in fact be actually right, depending on who you're siding with. But it definitely does bring a sense of security though, to the whole thing. Especially, I feel like online is one of the things that like it's specifically like useful for in a way. But we have things such as like the Tor browser we've talked about like countless times. But the fact that that was developed, by the U.S. government to be able to deliver secret messages and information that essentially couldn't be encrypted, I guess you could call it. That could just be spread around without fears And of course, we know like the darknet has a lot of bad stuff in it, but at the same time, a lot of people are using it for dissemination of information where countries don't necessarily allow for that type of thing. So in a way, being able to be anonymous, being able to have a sense of privacy brings a sense of security amongst all the bad stuff that's happening. So,
Ooh,
which is also
that's
kind of
really
an interesting
interesting.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a whole different type of security. Dang. I guess that also reminds me of there's like this Minecraft server thing like called like the Library of Alexandria,
Yeah.
where like people can go and like access like uncensored like articles, like journal articles that are like blocked in their countries.
Yeah.
So I think like allowing people to access like free journalism, that's another thing that I guess a lack of privacy does is I really wonder what it does with the dissemination of information and unobstructed journalism, right? Because like think if we're journalists, right, for example, and we're in China and China's watching our every move.
Right.
We say something bad, even if it's not, on purpose, and like we end up in jail or worse, it's what does that do to the psyche of like journalists? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that to me is really worrying because I mean, I guess this is more worrisome in a country like the US where, we have a democracy or at least a facade of a democracy
Right,
and
right,
like
right.
there should always be freedom of press and freedom of speech. But I really wonder how that would look if the US started implementing more of the stuff that's going on in like China and what that would do to our freedoms, I guess, of speech and journalism and stuff like that.
I personally think that it would be like super obstructive to free journalism in the way that you don't want to do anything that will make people go against you, be it the government or other people. And I think even though this is a little bit of an extreme example in some cases, like you can look at like Twitter, for example, right? We all know that Twitter is a great place where a lot of scandals usually happen and a lot of debates happen online. For good and bad reasons, right? I won't say that Twitter hasn't done bad, but also that it hasn't done good either. In some cases, but like I guess that's also an example of that. Like, think about your ability to post something on Twitter, right? Like I'm pretty sure that to a general person, if they were to post something on Twitter, they really have to think twice about what they're posting. Not only because is it correct, but is it agreeable to the people that use Twitter? Not even like your own thoughts and opinions, because we know the type of people that sometimes frequent those sites and what they like to do, right? There have been cases of, people making very bad comments, be it obviously like really bad ones, or it might just be more opinionated ones, where the harm isn't necessarily there as much. It might just be the fact that you don't like a show or you just don't like a character from a show. And it sparks into this whole debate where, bad things have happened. People have been doxxed, little threats have been at their door, things of a big magnitude where the only thing you did is state an opinion which didn't go with the general public's perception of that opinion. So I think Twitter is sort of like the way to look at like what would happen if a government were to always watch your every move in a way. I feel like in that same way, instead of like people randomly doing that to you, it might be the government, it might be your neighbors around you, and you'll be a lot more fearful and think twice a lot of the times between what you're saying and what would be agreeable to the general public, just because obviously you don't want to get hurt, right? Which I think is personally super dangerous. I think the way to combat this, instead of mass surveillance and cracking down on people, is to have more conversations, right? I feel like understanding is the way to pave a road to the future rather than cracking down on quote unquote bad actors just because you don't agree with them. Or at least that's my opinion.
Yeah, it's a really good point. This is kind of changing the discussion, but since we are in Maryland,
right,
and obviously there was a whole issue with these spy planes basically like
Okay,
circling the area.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a
Yes.
little?
So if you guys don't know already, there was. I'm pretty sure the project isn't going on still, just due to the gigantic backlash that happened. But back and I'm just citing an article from let's see, Bloomberg Business Week, by Monterreal. It's essentially talking about the fact that back in 2015, 2016, I believe, a private, essentially like security contractor with this company decided to reach out to Baltimore PD to get their service to be used by them. Essentially, what happened is a rich person somewhere decided to give this company a grant. The only way to get the grant, though, was to secure at least some space where they could use the technology. And they reached out to different cities, different states. Nothing worked until they got to Maryland, and more specifically Baltimore PD. Then they were able to reach an agreement where Baltimore PD would essentially let this company help Baltimore PD crack down on different things. And essentially, Baltimore PD didn't have to pay anything because this whole ordeal, or this trial run, if you will, was paid by the millionaire somewhere else. And so essentially, because of that, Baltimore PD decided not to disclose information regarding the fact that this private security company, or technology company, if you will, was essentially flying a plane over the skies of Baltimore that would essentially track everybody's movement. Albeit, you couldn't necessarily like zoom in on people and know exactly who they were. But if you can follow a dot on a map, that in combination with already ground cameras that they already have around, it's pretty easy to spot who did what. And the fact that people weren't made aware of this is extremely alarming. Of course, Baltimore PD can say that their department didn't pay for this, so they didn't necessarily need or had the feel to give this information out to the world. But it's so alarming that this thing happened and that a lot of people were affected by this. Sure, it might have been for a good cause, cracking down on crime. We obviously don't want bad things to happen or people to get hurt, but at the same time, you kind of have to think about the repercussions that it can have on certain communities, right? Maybe you're bringing more law enforcement to certain areas that will just increase, interactions with police that might end up in like bad places where otherwise that wouldn't have been the case. Different things of that sort. But it was pretty interesting the fact that all of this happened without the public knowing, right? So it just kind of makes you wonder of like how many other things might be happening that aren't necessarily disclosed yet.
True. That also raises the point of like other uses of like facial recognition and surveillance and stuff, like for example, like racial discrimination.
Right.
Like this technology makes it so much easier to discriminate against people, for you just like put in the keyword or something or
Right.
whatever you're looking for, and you can literally track people. And it's easier than ever before, and that is also very worrying. This reminds me, I know I was talking with Max one time, and he mentioned this, I think it was movie, Person of Interest, that basically discusses like the intersection of mass surveillance and AI, and it kind of got into some of this topics. So if you're looking for a cool movie to watch, definitely suggest that. There's also like the Snowden and like Citizen 4 movies, which also discuss like privacy issues and I guess more like personal device issues, I guess, and like how the government uses our information, which is also really interesting. And actually on the topic of personal devices, I guess because I guess the two main companies right now are Apple and Samsung, right?
Right.
Apple's like this closed source, presumably more secure system, and then you have Samsung, which is like open source, right? Android, Linux kernel, whatever. I mean, more. You're the CS. Do you want to talk about these? Like,
So like just
systems?
Going off of the basic differences of these, iOS, like you said, is very closed. Everything they do in house, even their chips nowadays for their phones are done in house, both for like their desktop computers and laptops to their phones. So everything is very integrated, very close. So they manage everything. Nobody gets to touch their information. It's all theirs. As opposed to Samsung and all these other companies who are on Android, which is actually open source based on the Linux kernel. Linux kernel is essentially just like a basic set of code that will essentially make the operating system for, it could be a desktop, could be anything else, and especially Android, which is what a lot of other phones run on, which makes it good and bad in two senses. One, iOS is closed, so you can't really do much about it. But the fact that Linux kernel is open source means that technically, if you have the capabilities to do this, you can technically make your own phone that is devoid of all these tracking, apps, which is good. But I think one of the questions to raise is the fact that how much can we genuinely rely on applications that are not connected to major servers, right? Because
Sure.
so many of the devices, so many of the technologies that we use, be it apps, be it programs, they're connected to servers that enable them to talk to one another, make things more seamless. Where if you disconnect yourself from that environment, it's almost like just not having a phone in a world where you kind of need one to be able to communicate with people.
True.
So, which, I don't know, raises the question of like, have we become a little bit too dependent on devices, and how has this dependency like actually impacted our ability to stray away from being targeted or being mass surveilled?
Yeah, for sure. Also on the topic of like personal device use, what browser or browsers would you say are most secure, like people should use?
In my personal opinion, I haven't done a lot of research on this. The one I personally use is Firefox, just because it has a little bit of everything. I would say it's not too bare bones to where you can't really add customization, you can't do a lot of stuff, but it does have a lot of protective features, which I really like. I would say that this is better in terms of security than like everybody uses Google Chrome, but Google Chrome. Another one that I've heard about, which I've seen ads for this, so don't quote me on this. This isn't like really what it is. But Brave browser, I've seen them market themselves as like the solution to browsers that don't take any information. For actually search engines, the one that I would recommend and that I know for a fact people use is DuckDuckGo.
Yeah.
So if you want a browser, maybe not like an actual, search. And a search engine, not a browser. So if you want a search engine that doesn't keep track of your data and stuff, go use DuckDuckGo. If you want to do that, if you don't want to switch browsers, browsers for that, at least for the PC side, right? You have what I would recommend: Brave browser and Firefox. And then for iOS, I would, if you want to, and if you really don't mind, I would say use just Safari.
Yeah.
Because that's tightly integrated into the Apple ecosystem. Nobody really touches that data except for Apple. And for one company to touch that data is better than to have 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah, for
touch
sure.
that data. So I would say if you're running like Mac OS or an iPhone, to use Safari, if you don't really need a lot of the fancy other stuff that these other browsers kind of want to give you in exchange for your data.
Cool. All right, so with that, go check out those browsers and search engines. Go check out the movies you recommended. Think about, I guess, in your personal life, like, do you think privacy or security, like what is more worth it, or does it depend on the context? But I think it's a really interesting conversation. I think it's a question we should be asking ourselves, especially in the age of all these amazing technologies like AI and surveillance and facial recognition. And with that, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you, Ricardo.
Yeah.
And we'll see you on the next one.
All right. See ya.
Bye.